Hey, what's going on, Stu, on this podcast, listeners? In today's episode, we're continuing on in our half-hearted series, and today we're going to be talking about 2 ways you can go full-hearted in your marriage. Well, what's going on, friends? It's so good to be hanging out with you today for another episode of the Stew on This podcast. As you may know, if you listen to this podcast on a regular basis, we are in a series really called Half-Hearted Creatures, which comes from a quote from C.S. Lewis, where he says that really our desires in this life, God wouldn't be all that impressed with. And a lot of it comes down to the fact that God has something really amazing in mind and in store for us, and yet we keep settling for lesser versions of that. And C.S. Lewis says, because of that, we are half-hearted creatures. And I love even the example that he gives. He says, basically, we're like kids playing with mud pies in the slum, while God has like this all-inclusive beach vacation in mind for us. So we have been on this series. 2 episodes ago, we talked about what it looks like to live half-hearted, in the sense that maybe we can't really even trust what our heart has to say to us, or we can't trust letting our heart lead because it might just not be that trustworthy. And then last week we looked at half-hearted parenting. If you have followed through with any of the challenges from last week when it came to the parenting talk, I would love to know how that impacted you this last week with you and your kiddos. But in today's episode, we are going to be talking about half-hearted marriages. And really, in particular, we're going to be talking about one thing that anyone can do in order to live full-hearted in the marriage. And really, that one thing is just called intentionality. Really, intentionality is the overall key factor to parenting, to our walk with the Lord, to marriage. And you'll kind of hear that theme through this series. But I also wanted to point out what I believe is a key tool that the enemy uses against us to move us towards a half-hearted marriage. And that key thing is comfortability. I think the enemy, Satan, uses the concept of comfortability to lead us towards half-hearted marriages. Now, hear me out. I'm not saying that comfortability is a bad thing. Like, I believe that we should be comfortable with the person that we are married to, especially as we get to know each other better and we do life with each other. Like, we learn each other's flaws, and we just kind of go, okay, that's who this person is. I love you anyways. Like, comfortability is a good thing. However, I also believe that comfortability is a tool that the enemy uses in order to drive a wedge between us and our spouse. Because here's the thing, when we were in the dating phase of our relationships, we put way more intentionality behind it, right? I'll give you an example. Like, when we're in the dating phase, we dress to impress. We're always dressing up nice. We want to look the best that we possibly can because we want to look like a stud for that girl, guys, that we're chasing after, or we just want to be drop dead gorgeous, right, ladies? You're beautiful. In case nobody told you that, you're beautiful. We're willing to spare no expense when it comes to the dates that we go on. Like, we just kind of throw out money as if it holds no value in our lives, just because we want to shower the person that we're wanting to impress with anything and everything that they want. And we spend a lot of time just really getting to know each other. We learn the likes and the dislikes and all that kind of stuff. That's called intentionality. We're putting intentionality into understanding who this person is and just seeing, one, man, are they worth the time and investment and getting to know them? And usually at some point in time, we go, man, this person is somebody really worth chasing after. And I'm going to do anything and everything I can to spend the rest of my life with this individual. I remember when I got to that point with Melissa, one thing that I started to do as part of my role of intentionality in the relationship, and I still have it today, but I started to keep a note that I have, again, still today, that just tells me everything about my now wife. But then I was asking her just the simple questions. What's your favorite color? What's your favorite food? What's your favorite animal? What's your shoe size? All those kinds of things. That way I would be able to surprise her with gifts based off of things that she wants or needed. And I didn't have to ask the question, what is this? What is your favorite candy or color or anything anymore? Because I took the time to write it down someplace that I can reference back to it, and gave me the opportunity to surprise her in those moments. but it's called intentionality. And the problem is when we step into a season of comfortability where we feel like we don't have to fight to impress the person anymore because they know our flaws, our disgusting habits, and all of that kind of stuff, that I believe Satan uses in order to slither his way into the marriage. If I were to give just a couple of different examples, even through scripture, where we kind of see this happening, like that kind of being Satan's characteristic, I would just point to 1 Peter 5:8, where Peter says, "Stay alert, watch out for your great enemy, the devil. He prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour." But then if we also look all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, we see where the idea of comfortability really opened up a way for the enemy to destroy everything that God had created. It's in Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, and it says this. It says, "The woman was convinced. She saw that the tree was beautiful and its fruit looked delicious, and she wanted the wisdom it would give her. So she took some of the fruit and ate it. Then she gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate it too." You see, what I believe, what I see there, look, if I were to give a little bit of a backstory first, I guess I'll start there. When God created everything, he created everything and he says that it was good. But then he looked at mankind, specifically Adam, who he created, and saw that he was alone. And that was the one thing that God said was not good. So God said, I'm going to make a suitor, a helper who is suitable for him. And that person ended up being Eve. Now, God told Adam, like, everything that's in this creation, in this garden, is for your pleasure. And Adam was supposed to cultivate and look over it. And God said, but hear me out. There's two things that you are supposed to stay away from. Like God said, all the vegetation that is in this garden, that's for you, Adam. Have at it, eat it, enjoy. But stay away from the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. God gave Adam one simple command. And as people who are supposed to be disciples who make disciples, it then became Adam's responsibility as the head of the household, the spiritual leader, to pass down those commands to Eve. And we see that he did. He did his job, because all of a sudden in chapter 3, the serpent, Satan, enters in onto the scene and he starts questioning God's goodness to Adam and Eve by saying, like, look, God's just wanting to keep the good stuff away from you. He's withholding. He doesn't trust you. He doesn't XYZ, right? And he starts planting seeds of doubt in Eve's mind. And Eve ultimately chooses to disobey God's command, takes of the fruit of the tree of good and evil and eats it, but then offers it to her husband, who is right there, who is supposed to be the protector, who is supposed to be the provider. And what I think is he just got into a state of comfortability of, I told my wife that this is what God said we're not supposed to do. I did my job. I'm done. And I believe that comfortability opened up a way for Satan to come in and still kill and destroy, which it is his character and is what he always does. The question that we need to ask ourselves is, am I intentional in working to keep my marriage together? Am I intentional? Are you intentional in working to keep your marriage together when the enemy is intentional in trying to tear it apart? Because make no mistake, marriages are under attack today. In America alone, 53% of marriages end in divorce. 53%. And if you get married a second time, the chances of that marriage ending in divorce is even higher than the first one. Another place where we see that marriage is under attack is with each new passing generation. With every new generation, what we see is that the age of people getting married is getting later and later. People are holding off for a longer period of time to get married. Now, there are probably so many different reasons why that is. Some people are saying, hey, I just want to get settled into my career. I want to finish school. I want to do all these kinds of things. And those are great goals and ambitions to have. However, I would like to point out that I also think that a key reason why each generation is getting married at later ages is because more people are more comfortable with playing marriage than actually getting married. I think people are more comfortable with saying, I want to live with this guy or girl. I love them. I'm devoted to them. I'm just not committed to them. Like, I want to be able to have one foot in, one foot out in case things go crazy in this relationship. And so I think my personal opinion is marriages are under attack by our culture becoming more and more accepting of the idea of it's okay for you to live together. You don't have to get married. In fact, we would encourage that you do live with each other to make sure that you're compatible. Understand, none of us are compatible with our future spouse. None of us. Why? Because our nature is to be sinful, which means we're to be selfish. So none of us are compatible with the person that we will eventually get married to. You have to be intentional and work hard to be compatible to that person and put aside your selfish desires and serve the other one with the hopes that they're going to do that as well. That was a sermon in and of itself. You're welcome. Let's go back to the podcast. So here's the thing. If Satan is going to be intentional in tearing marriages apart, then we must be intentional in working hard and keeping our marriages together. And that's where we come down to the two things that I believe that we can do in order to be full-hearted in our approach to our marriages. That way we're not half-hearted creatures in this realm. So the first thing that we need to do is that we need to keep God at the center of our marriage. Now, I know that seems like a cheap answer, but to be honest with you, it's God first, and then everything else will fall into place. I truly believe that. So you need to be praying with your spouse. You need to be going to church with your spouse. You need to be serving. You need to be reading the Bible with each other. You need to be in community with other people who are holding you accountable, and they're fighting for your marriage right alongside with you. And I would also encourage that you get into like devotionals, marriage devotionals. Melissa and I are doing one right now that it's going to take a year for us to get through. We just read it once a week, and we've just set aside time on Mondays that before we do anything else, after we get the girls down, we sit down and we go through this marriage devotional with each other. We read the content, and then we ask ourselves the questions, and then we always end in prayer. And then past that point, we can get back to what would be a regular, evening for us in the McPherson household. But if you do those things to keep God at the center of your marriage, that is the beginning spot to be full-hearted in your approach to your marriage. Now, the second thing that you need to do is you need to fight against comfortability. Comfortability, again, is the enemy to marriages. It's the tool that the enemy will use to fight to tear apart your marriages. So you have to fight against comfortability. And I would say start fighting for your dates. It's hard to get a date night in, especially when you're in the season with kids. So you need to fight to get in that time. And then the other thing that you need to do is you need to continue to learn who your spouse is. Seasons change, which means that we as people change. So get to know who your spouse is again. Learn everything about them, and then and then be ready for that to shift and change once again. You just can't get comfortable with who your spouse is, because we change as people, as creatures. So my suggestion to you would be, if you've never read this book, pick up the 5 Love Languages by Dr. Gary Chapman and get to know what your spouse's love language is. And if you've read the book before, let me encourage you, read it again, because our love languages change based off of the seasons that we're in. When Melissa and I first were engaged, getting married, my love language was physical touch. I can tell you now, my love language is more words of affirmation. But the important thing in this is to know that we have to make sure that all 5 of those love tanks are full, because if you're feeling depleted in any one area, you're going to feel depleted in your love language and your love emotional gas tank altogether. So make sure that all 5 of those love languages are filled, not just the primary ones, but all of them as well. And then the other thing that I would say is do marriage counseling. We do a really good job of preventative maintenance when it comes to our cars, but we don't do a good job of preventative maintenance when it comes to our marriages. So hop into, my daughter's trying to sneak into the room here, but hop into doing not premarital, but marriage counseling. And that might be something as simple as there's a program out there called Symbis Plus. Melissa and I did it during our 5-year anniversary, and it was greatly beneficial to us, because what we noticed through there was some of the things that were red flags to us when we were getting married were no longer red flags, but were things that we were thriving in because we were intentional about it. And then come year 5, there are going to be things that are going to be red flags that you didn't realize were red flags, because you've welcomed in new elements to your life that weren't there before. like kids. So by being intentional with counseling, all that kind of stuff, doing preventative maintenance is going to fight against that idea of comfortability, because you're constantly learning and growing. So something that we should ask ourselves as I close this out is, if Satan's wholeheartedly wholeheartedly wanting to kill your marriage, then you need to be wholehearted in making sure that you're not creating a space for him to get in and attack. So I hope that this episode is a blessing to you. Be sure to leave a rating, review, share, subscribe, do all those good things. If you want to connect with me, you can do so with the Stew on This podcast at gmail.com, or you can reach out to me on any social media platforms. All those links are in the show notes. And I will see you next week for another episode of the Stew on This podcast. Be blessed.